Hello, journeyers. My name's Tony Carnes, your host for A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. And with us today, we have Brian Finnerty, our producer. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Tony, good to be with you.
You know, there's lots of religion and politics in the air lately. Have you been noticing, Brian?
Absolutely. So, Tony, what did you think of the president's Soul of the Nation speech?
Yes, on September 1st in 2022, he gave this famous call to war. It was titled, actually, "The Soul of the Continued Battle for the Soul of the Nation." And what is striking, of course, is how he mixed religious and political rhetoric. It's not unusual in American politics that religion and politics always go together. In almost every campaign, that's been true. His speech was a serious speech, and he cast himself as a missionary, battling for the soul of the nation against various devils, which he lists, that are threatening the soul of the nation. He even had sort of a gospel or good news for the nation. He says the soul of America is defined, notice the language, by the sacred proposition that all are created equal in the image of God. He even borrowed a few lines from the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville, who in his Democracy America describes early America as having the habits of the heart of a religious people. And then Robert Bellah, a sociologist, picked that up for his book, a very famous book, Habits of the Heart. Biden said that democracy, American greatness, and our optimism depends on the cultivating the habits of our heart. And then he issued an oral prayer. And may God protect all those who stand watch over our democracy. You know, it was quite a speech that, of course, it was somewhat of a campaign speech. He got criticized for that, but it was a very striking how he interwove religion and politics.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, Tony, he seems to have a track record of that. He seems to be much more comfortable using that sort of language. Like back in the time of the Charlotte protests, he came out with the speech of that, and I think I remember reading a biography of his campaign in which they're searching for terminology that would be appropriate, and he's much more upfront about his Catholicism than some other Democratic leaders are, and so it's very much characteristic of his style, I would say.
Yes, you're right, and and I think that his religious imagery, his Catholic imagery, resonates here in the city with both people that are for or against. And I think that actually the religious political debate and languages are being heard in almost all of the various denominations, types of religious congregations here in the city. Some don't want to talk about it, but others do. Some have one view or the other. And some.
So how about the evangelicals? I think you've been paying pretty good attention to them, to their response. That some of them maybe don't really want to talk about this so much. Others are more eager to dive into it.
Well, you're exactly right. There's a big roaring debate in the evangelical churches and about evangelical churches, because one exit poll from Trump's 2020 election, the exit poll said that 80% of the evangelicals voted for Trump. Now, this created an uproar, and both within the evangelicals, particularly some younger evangelicals, and those, and the one that are more politically liberal, and also an uproar by people who never liked the evangelicals anyway. And in the city, there are quite a few evangelicals, probably between 20 and up to a quarter of the city are evangelical Protestants. And then a certain number would Catholics would identify as evangelical in the sense they proclaim the faith.
Yeah, and I suppose a big question in all this is how you actually define evangelical, right? Yeah, because that's a rather broad term, and then I think even sometimes before the polling amongst the Catholics about whether they lean Democratic versus leaning Republican. If you just simply self-identify as Catholic, that's one thing in terms of the results of the polls. Versus if you ask people how often you go to church, that's going to very much more correlate, with their behavior in terms of voting on certain issues or their attitudes on certain issues. So these polls that said the evangelicals were 80% in favor of Trump, how do they define all that?
Well, that you're exactly right, and it sometimes gets defined by the audience who are using these figures. When the poll came out, the exit poll, this is they ask voters when they come out of the polling, who did you vote for and what are your beliefs? They ask two religious questions. One, are you Catholic, Protestant, Jew, or something else? And then they ask a separate question, are you an evangelical? Now, that's the beginning of the problem. The myth of that there are 80% of the evangelicals voted for Trump became a myth for both the right and left. The right likes it because it says, oh, look how powerful we are. The left likes it because, oh, we always knew the evangelicals were bad, and we now really can identify them. But in fact, the people that answer the question, are you evangelical, they could be of any faith. In fact, a very large portion of those answers were from Catholics and also from some Jews and from Buddhists. So what did that question mean? And what happens is the answer to the question enters the mythology of the different political actors, and they make of it what they will. When one of the long-time problems in polling is they say they lump together Jews, Catholics, Protestants, all in one lump, which is, as you know, is not very meaningful. There are all types of Jews and Catholics and Protestants, and some hardly even go to church. In fact, later, when you look at that 80% who say they're evangelicals for Trump, most of those are non-church goers. That is, they identify with that label, but they don't go to church. They're not very active in religion, and they just identify with that. And the same thing as, with Catholics and Jews. Many Jews, for example, will identify, oh, I'm Jewish and I believe Judaism, but they don't show up except for maybe holidays at the best. So what does that mean?
All right. So Tony, so for academics or evangelical leaders themselves, what does it mean to be an evangelical?
Well, typically they go back, and Tim Keller points this out in a recent 4-chapter online book that he has published, The Rise and Decline of American Evangelicals. He points out that David Beebington had 4 points to define evangelicals, and it's based on a theological definition. 1, they believe the Bible is God's word. 2, they believe they need to preach the good news, and so they're missionary oriented. And those 2 things are actually essential in those 4-point definition. And that Keller adds, says, well, but also, evangelicals and all religious people are identified by what social location they are. Are they working class or upper class? I don't know if his argument is that persuasive, but typically they would look at, well, an evangelical an evangelical believes in the Bible. They believe that you need to preach the word of God and that you're only saved if you confess Jesus Christ. And this should, affect your whole life. That's the typical definition of evangelical. But you know, theological definitions and what people believe in the pews are two different things. People may, if you ask people in the pews, they may say to all four principles that Beaverton outlines, that's called the Beaverton quadrangle or something like that. They would say, oh yeah, I agree with that. But if you ask them what does it mean, you get, you know, answers all over the place. This is true about religion.
Yeah,
In history, I remember that we happened upon a wonderful report of a priest back in the late Middle Ages from southern France. And he was sent there to find out what did the villagers really think. Did they believe in Jesus and Mary or what? And he comes back, he says they believe all sorts of things. He cannot believe this is a Catholic village. You know, they want to talk more about the, you know, the goblins under the tree.
yeah,
And
it's funny. I think this is almost like a lot easier in the case of the Catholic Church, in which you can have like an umpire that calls balls and strikes. Yes, this is what we believe. No, no, this is not what we believe. Yeah, but but there's not really something like that within Protestantism or the evangelical world.
well, they have to argue it out. And in fact, that's Tim Keller's new book says that, you know, it's going to be an argument. And he has his version of the bad guy he calls the fundamentalist. And he identifies him as a conservative. So he said, you know what, we're going to, you know, have a fight, and whoever has the, we're going to see who's right.
So yeah, is one definition of a fundamentalist is a conservative that I don't like.
I think that's right. You know, historically, the word goes back to just right around World War I. The evangelicals were having the Protestants were divided between those liberal Protestants, that is, those Protestants that believed that the doctrines of the faith were evolving. And it's the same thing in the Supreme Court. The Constitution's there, but it's evolving what it really means. And it's evolving away from supernaturalism. And they argued over the virgin birth of Mary, and the liberals said, no, she was, you know, she was a young girl, who knows what was true. The evangelicals decided, the conservative Protestants decided to issue a series of pamphlets called the Fundamentals of the Faith. And they said that modernists, who they were the liberals in their terms, don't agree with this, but this is what the faith has always been. Well, the moderate move was clever. They took the word fundamentalist and made it a boogeyman.
A pejorative term, even though it was originally a self-described term.
Yes. And they said in a famous sermon by the preacher at Riverside Church, did a famous sermon published in a pamphlet. It's a very fine sermon called "Will the Fundamentalist Win?" And then Mencken and other reporters took that up as, yeah, the fundamentalists are the stupid party, and the racist party, and the violent party, and the ignorant party, and against all progress. And it became a epithet, much like Puritanism became a negative word.
I wonder if a more useful term for all this would be like literalists. I mean, so there, you could say, have a real dividing line of, you know, whether or not you insist on a literal interpretation of scripture and things like Genesis and so on. So that might have more real content than simply a pejorative term of fundamentalist.
Well, what the fundamentalists came back, well, there was the Protestant, the conservative Protestants split into two groups. One, that group decided to call themselves fundamentalists. They took it as a badge of honor, you know, like it used to be calling somebody black was sort of an insult, and blacks wanted to be called Negroes or African Americans.
Maybe it's like the deplorables. They said, okay,
we take it as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
But what characterized them was that they were very militant. They were very combative. They were very used to using denunciatory language. The other Protestants, conservative Protestants, said, no, we don't believe in, punching you in the face. We believe in talking with you. And they, after World War II, they created a new name for themselves called evangelical.
Mm.
And Carl Henry, the founder of the magazine Christianity Today, and other conservative Protestants refashion themselves. We're not against science. We're not against the modern world. We're not, we're not all the bad things they tell us. We're actually the proponents of progress in society, but we keep our basic faith principles intact. And that had a real big impact here and in the nation. And a lot of these debates took place right here in New York, had a real impact, so that after the 50s, toward the late 50s, the modernists, or they would call themselves progressives or liberals, all were losing congregation because they no longer really believed their stated principles.
I suppose, there might be like a real question of why, sort of like, why bother going to church on a Sunday if you're just getting the editorial page of the New York Times,
Well, that's right. And so some people said, well, I can do without, going on Sunday morning and tithing. I'll just stay home. Or what happened is, and this is true here in the city, many started saying, well, who does believe? And they found the evangelicals. Let me give an interesting study that was done by us, actually, that in the in 1999, late 90s, 98, 99, there was a survey of the religion of college students here in New York, including college students at Barnard and Columbia and NYU and other places. About 18,000, 15,000 college students were asked, about their beliefs. And there was one notable finding. If you asked they asked also what your parents' beliefs were. And it's notable that the students that said their parents were Episcopalians, which is a very liberal denomination, 80% of them said they were no longer Episcopalians. They left. And that's true. The Episcopal Church has lost here in the city, lots of people. But this was the turn. You asked them, well, what are you now? And they would say, the majority of them, the kids would say, oh, we're evangelicals. This is at Barnard and Columbia and NYU and City College. They would say, we're evangelicals. And that was a sign in the city that the evangelicals were resurging here in the city. And in fact, that resurge started probably in the 70s. It was unnoticed, but grew. And as the young people got out of college, they joined evangelical churches. And they grew. And after 2000, the evangelical churches in Manhattan just exploded.
So Tony, I think we've talked about before that there's some debate right now on whether or not the evangelical movement is in decline. And so what's sort of the state of that debate, and where do you sort of weigh in on that?
Yeah, there's that's of course the emphasis of Tim Keller's book, but also others have warned it. Say there are two decline myths or stories. One is that because the evangelicals ended up for Trump, they're losing scores of people, particularly their young people, and they're leaving.
And does the data support that?
Well, no, not exactly. The surveys of evangelical youth find they're the least likely to leave their faith. Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, they're likely to leave their faith. That's the nuns that have grown. Most of those come from liberal Protestants, Catholics, all probably more liberal Catholics, although I don't know, and from liberal Jews. and they have become the nuns. That's by far the
And
largest.
you're saying that amongst the Catholics, the nuns are the children of liberal Catholics generally? Is that what
Well,
you're
I'm
saying?
proposing it. I don't know that to be true.
Okay.
It's
Well,
something.
why don't you tell people who may not have heard of it? So what does this thing mean, the nuns? You know,
It means I don't have any particular religious belief. It doesn't mean I disbelieve in God. I might believe in God. It doesn't mean that I don't have certain Christian beliefs, but it means I don't have any particular residence, identity as any particular religion. Maybe I'm mixing things together. You've got the phenomena in New York of Jew-boos.
yeah.
Jew-boos are Jewish Buddhist. That is, they mix in their Jewish sort of identity, a very progressive one, with the Buddhist beliefs, which means they don't necessarily have to believe in God. And so this is common, this fluidity. And I think we find that sometimes there's two types of fluidity of the nuns. One is just sort of drifting into it, and that's probably the majority. There are also some that are reacting against their upbringing because it was too strict, or maybe their parents were Trump or whatever, and they are very militantly nun. They didn't just drift and they could drift back. They've got an edge because they felt some sort of fight, usually with their family. And you find that you find a movement of ex-evangelicals. There's an organization called that, and ex-Catholics and so forth. And usually they're very militant about it, but most just drift away. And sometimes it's because of the misdeeds in the churches. Certainly the evangelicals have had, nationally, and here locally too, scandals. Some pastor does something bad, and there's disillusionment from it because people, face. So this creates a people that have a voice, and they like to interpret. The ex-evangelicals like to say that we're growing. We're the majority want to be of the youth.
Let's get back to a second, briefly to summarize it. Okay, so there's that headline. 80% of evangelicals supported Trump, and then there's been some back and forth since then about whether or not that was really true. So can you sort of replay a little bit about briefly, what happened there with the back and forth, and where things seem to stand right now about what the answer to that really is?
Well, you see this play out in New York, that you have Trumpers like Bishop Joseph Mattera, or I believe at least some of his friends are big on Trump. I'm not quite sure where he stands. Or you have Eric Metaxas, the talk show host, who's a self-avowed big Trumper. And then you have more liberals or moderates in politics. Now, what's happened is they want to blame each other for the problems of America. The anti-Trump evangelicals would say, why do we have crime in the streets? Why do we have conflict? Why do we have racism? Why do we have attacks on Asian Americans and other people of color? Why do we have crime? It's all because of the conservative evangelicals who ignore social needs, don't recognize their own racism, don't pay attention to other people other than themselves. Now, there's several, so they weave together a narrative that has some truth, and it, like all criticisms, the mirror may be cracked, but it's still a mirror. But there are also some mythologies that are woven in here. That is causing, ends up being big fights over the mythologies. For example, that and this is accentuated by the context. In the nation, in the city, the U.S. Census for a while proclaimed that America was becoming a majority minority, and that the city was too, that whites were disappearing, and pretty soon they'll be in the minority. And this created this dogma by the U.S. Census, created both sides in the church took notice of this. You also get, and in fact, U.S. and New York's not becoming a majority minority anytime soon. The whites in New York are growing. So what are we going to do with that? Also, they would say the white Christian nationalists are trying to theocratically create a theocracy and take over things. And so we cannot let them have any part in government, because before you know it, they'll take
and
over.
briefly, how about participation of religious leaders in the events of January 6th? What do you see there in terms of what's been reported or speculated, what seems to be true?
Well, yes, often that's connected to the white Christian nationalists, attacked the Congress, and they were led by evangelical leaders. And in fact, there's probably almost no evangelical leaders were inside the Capitol. There maybe have been one pastor from Texas that got fired over it, but other than that, there are no clergy. And outside, there were a few clergy, but they didn't go inside. And so what we see more representative of the religion of the invaders of the Capitol was the QAnon shaman. The QAnon shaman who mixes Christian words and pagan words and all together, and he walks in with his horns and all of that. So it seems like it's sort of a myth that grew up because it fits the political situation. Look, we could talk about this more. We'll talk about this with other groups. My name's Tony Carnes with A Journey Through NYC Religions, and our host, Brian Finnerty, our producer, Brian Finnerty, who's been throwing some questions and thoughts here. Thank you very much for being with us.